Okay, I am with Jane Gatsby, a young philosopher and the newest member of the intellectual dark web. So she has a new YouTube channel / podcast that has been very interesting. I shared it a little bit on my group and page and got some good feedback, and some people thought it'd be cool if we could chat a little bit. So that's what we're going to do today. I told her when we were preparing this that I was most interested in talking about complexity theory, and then a little bit on how she ended it with her last episode or two. So, but before we go there, let me just tell us a little bit about yourself, Jane, and how you decided to get into this. But what I'm, I guess, most interested in is how you decided to get into doing this in your unique Wonderland dream way.
Well, the format itself is something that was kind of like a little bit unintentional, maybe, because I devised like the maze metaphor for the first episode, just talking about philosophy. And then I kind of, as I was concluding it, I realized, well, maybe I can kind of keep this going. And I kind of just kept having an idea of what the like subsequent episode of
So
how
it kind
to
of
tie
took on
these
a life of
ideas
its
in.
own.
Exactly. But now I have to deal with the consequence of, it's not like I've got a full timeline planned out of like, these are going to be the narrative points. So every episode I release, I now have to be like, I'm kind of just hoping that out there in the universe, somehow things will come together as they need to. And that so far has continued to happen. But it's not like I have a plan on paper of like, oh, and then this is going to happen next time. I'm just hoping that the ideas overlap nicely with the story. But also I hope that people are being lenient enough listening that the story isn't the main driving component.
Oh, well, it helps because you're making a lot of philosophical points, and especially philosophical points that are your own. And with that, it's easy to sort of seem like there's an argument to be had. But if it's more of a this dreamlike metaphor, it's easier to just get people to go along for the ride. So I think it's really working out for you. And actually, I told you when I first kind of hit you up a little while ago, I was like, I really like it because you have a talent for it. And what I was telling you to is, what's her name? Scarlett Johansson. I do one of the like my little secret indulgement is I listen to her read Alice in Wonderland, the actual book, because it's just really cool the way that she does it with her, I guess, talent for a dramatic voice. Was there it seemed like you realized that you have a talent for this dramatic voice. Was there something that went to that when you're like, I have a talent for this, so I should use that?
It's funny, like I was like a theater kid in high school, so I got a little bit of like, acting chops from that. I think generally, both with the way it's delivered and then also the style in which it's delivered, my goal is accessibility, where I want, like, it doesn't matter if English isn't your first language, if you're like an 80-year-old woman, or if you're maybe like if one of my friends who's my age and is maybe more on the progressive, like woke side of things or something like that. Like just anyone can listen, and there's the language is going to be accessible to anyone. And then also the delivery style. I'm not going at a really quick rate or something, which bothers some people. The ASMR kind of component, I wasn't really thinking about that much. I think the problem was with the first episode, I just recorded it so many times that after, I don't know if you have any experience with this, but sometimes like if you kind of really get used to reciting something in a certain way, then you can't really break from that mold anymore. So that like really slow pronounced delivery. I really like writing, and I think I've got a good way with words. And so I wanted to be able to draw attention to the fact that it's kind of, the ideas are being skillfully knitted together, and the diction is really important in the delivery as well.
Like one thing that comes to mind just when you say that is some of the best writers, like Robert Greene, for example, will say that, it's not just important the way that these ideas come together and the words come together on the paper, but what he'll do is he'll actually say it out loud, like over and over again as he's writing it, because that's just the way the mind works, and you want the mind to work that way. So it seems almost like you found a I don't know, like a next level delivery method, even if that wasn't
Thanks.
exactly what you're going for.
I'll take it.
Okay, yeah. Well, because I don't know, I guess I'm really into audiobooks and that type of thing anyway. So
Mm.
if you take the idea of putting your ideas into audio format and then actually like making sure that that's done well, it does take it to that next level.
Yeah, growing up, I listened to a lot of like bedtime books on like little
Yeah.
cassettes on tape and stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think part in the back of my head that was like I liked just as a kid falling asleep listening to someone like reading a story. And then I know like my mom always listens, she like has pretty bad insomnia and she'll listen to podcasts to fall asleep. So I've had a few people message me being like, hey, is it okay if I like listen to this going to bed? I'm like, of course. Like I was joking with someone the other day, like it becomes like subliminal messaging, like while you're sleeping, like Brave New World. I'm like trying to reinforce these ideas.
It's a normal thing with yours and with others.
Oh, cool.
That's funny that people like, is this creepy?
I mean, yeah, people can be so funny in what they feel the need to like ask consent for online, but like, sure.
I don't want you to find out about this. Then I'm like listening to you as I go into my own.
But then meanwhile, I get other messages from people being like, "Oh, I've jerked off to your photos like so many times," and I'm like, "Good for you."
Good for you.
No comment.
Yeah, you didn't ask for permission for that.
Although that would be kind of weird too. Like, what are you gonna say? Like,
do I have your consent? No. Okay, moving on. I need to find a girl that'll give me consent to jerk off to her photos. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Okay. All right. So, but without much further ado into the whole like jerking off.
Sorry, I've derailed things a little.
No, it's good. Actually, I had a whole podcast that was mostly on the idea of pornography and jerking off. What's interesting about that, we won't go down that rabbit hole too much, but Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris talk about that for like a minute, and then they're like, we don't want to go down there today. But it is a whole other interesting debate, and yeah, that's enough of that rabbit hole for now. Anyway, so what I'm more interested in with you is complexity theory. And there's a few different ways that you word that, and I think it's a good one, and one that I don't know enough about, which is why I wanted to talk to you a bit about it, and one that I feel like probably can and probably should evolve and integrate with other theories. So I just listened to it, but can you tell me and the listeners who haven't heard a bit of like the general overview and idea of what complexity theory is?
Yeah, so complexity theory is the study of complex adaptive systems.
Right.
And complex adaptive systems are a little bit difficult to describe, because they can be found like across like social areas as well as like natural systems, and they're united by having the fact that they have certain governing features. But the main quality that defines a complex adaptive system is that it's a system that's comprised of multiple agents who interact by their own rules kind of independently, and from those interactions you get emergent behavior that can't be localized in any of the individual agents. So a really classic example is an ant colony, where all of the ants are walking around and they've got very limited like drives telling them what to do and where to go. But then, and the ants are really stupid on their own, but then because of the way that they interact within the colony, the ant colony itself kind of becomes this emergent agent that has more intelligence than any of the ants in isolation.
Yeah, I think you made an interesting point. I forget exactly how you worded it with the ant colony, but how if they only stuck to their one lines of like food source, they would eventually die. So it's almost like stupidity is built into it, where sometimes a foolish ant has to like wander off, and then that might not work out for him, but he might find a new food source. So it almost makes me think of how Jordan Peterson often mentions the Carl Jung quote, how the fool is the precursor to the savior. So it's kind of the same thing with these little foolish heroic savior ants that they've got to wander off on their own to find new things. And it's cool the way that you built on that idea to your latest episode on the the moral individual, because there always has to be both. There has to be the collective world and then the individual world, and there's just no getting around that. They play off each other. So how did you come about that idea? Because I really like the ant colony idea. Is it just that it fits in so well with the complex adaptive system idea that you were getting at?
With like individual agents.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think like Mill kind of talks about that in
Oh, yeah.
On Liberty, I think. Yeah, like another characteristic of complex systems is that they always exist in relation to an environment, and the
Right.
environment's changing and the system is changing. And so like, evolution of plants or animals are also complex in how you need mutation, and you need difference, and then if that happens to be more suitable to the environment, then that characteristic will propagate and become magnified over time. And so I think you can kind of take the same idea and apply it to societies where if people are just abiding by whatever the norms and standards are of like the last decade, and you just never change anything, then the world around you is going to keep changing, and also like our technology is going to keep evolving. So it makes sense that you need to have people that are able to independently think for themselves and come to their own conclusions, because the world isn't the same world it was 10 years ago even.
Yeah. And then one thing that I guess comes to mind with this is how again, I hate to sometimes bring up the infamous name over and over again, but like Jordan Peterson often mentions how we are all kind of this, like, each individual person is sort of this conglomeration or this like ball of personalities within a personality. So it's kind of like each individual mind or consciousness set within an individual person has their own complexity we've woven in with their own personalities within and their own hierarchies within, and that expands out. But I guess sort of what you're getting at in these the main sort of overarching point is how the sort of hinge or the filter that everything has to go through is the individual, and how the individual chooses to adapt and chooses to go with things, or when to rebel or when to not. So I'm just trying to get a better grasp on what makes complex adaptive theory what it is.
Like the governing features, maybe.
Yeah.
So I think I list 5 in the episode, and that is that they are they're self-similar, or they've got like a fractal characteristic to them. So you can zoom out or in, and then they'll have the same proportions and stuff like that, and the same relationships can be found on different levels of analysis. They are nonlinear, so that ties in a lot with, like, if you want to talk about individualism, like one small change can have a dramatic impact that ripples throughout the system. Nowadays, more than ever, one person, Jordan Peterson, can do a little thing, and then that ripples out through the world, and suddenly he's having a huge disproportionate impact, where it's like now no man under 30 hasn't heard at least one of his lectures, basically. They are bottom up, so that comes with like the idea that there's no top-down control being imposed. Everything's coming from individual agents making decisions. So for me, that plays into like my next episode. I'm going to be talking about government, and like I'm a libertarian, so that kind of ties in with that as well. Like there's good reasons as to why you should want to have bottom-up coordination rather than top-down, because those top-down schemas are always going to become outdated more rapidly than you can democratically vote to change them or whatever. What are other ones?
Well, I guess maybe the main thing is, with these systems as they are, which is, you could almost call them natural social patterns, or natural cognitive patterns of society, how is it that they work really well, or how is it that they have failures that can potentially be solved, and how do we solve them?
So do you know who Nassim Taleb is?
Not very well.
Okay, he's an interesting thinker. He's
Okay.
kind of controversial because he's kind of like hot-tongued or something in his approach.
Okay. Okay.
But I like him a lot, and he's like a systems theorist. And I think, I'm not sure if he coined the term anti-fragility or not, but that represents the idea that these systems that allow for what you're talking about earlier, the randomness works to their benefit. So if you have the ant wandering around, that ant isn't just a dumb ant that's causing the rest of the colony to lose food, because if it finds a better source of food, then that's actually making the system more stable in the long run. And so anti-fragility is a really important concept that complexity sustains. And same thing again, if you think about evolution or something.
So generally, though, what can go wrong with the complex systems? So not to say like if they are right or wrong, but assuming that we live in these complex adaptive systems, what can go wrong with them, and how can we fix the problems that can go wrong within these systems?
So an issue that can arise is that if you get a little bit of like corruption at some point, where some little, I'm not sure how you'd frame it, some little interaction isn't quite, it's operating off of a bad premise, you could say, or something, where like there's something wrong that's misdirecting the information. Then you can have, another characteristic that kind of goes with the nonlinearity is feedback loops, right? So once something starts, then it kind of begins to snowball more and more. You can have things that snowball that actually aren't beneficial to the broader functions of the system. And so if you're cognizant of how these things work and that they are maybe susceptible to that, then you can know to step in and say, oh, here's where this little corruption took place, this is why, and we're going to set it straight now. And then you can de-escalate those things.
Because one thing that comes to mind is, I forget the exact way that Peterson said it, but it was that ideologies are like parasites that sort of leech on or latch on to the archetypal innate sort of substructure to to humanity. So I guess it's kind of like you're saying that there can be corruption within a natural system like that, and the corruption can often come in the form of an ideology. So I think that the what may be going on is there's a natural sort of value system in place, but we're not always conscious of it. And then what happens is ideologies can attach to that, and they can come out as a corrupt version of the actual sort of archetypal substructure, or the value structure that's within it. So I guess sort of to the point of like what can go wrong, how can we fix it, is it's like that there are false versions of our archetypal cognitive structure that go on to society, mostly in the form of corrupt ideologies. And then the right thing to do is to adapt that ideology, or overcome it, or eliminate it, or update the system, or update the tradition, or to get sort of like in a Peterson sort of terms is like resurrect the father from the belly of the whale sort of thing. So I don't know, how would you put it in those terms, as far as how to deal with ideologies that can latch on to our natural systems?
Yeah, one thing I talked a lot in the last episode I did is about like the idea of good reason and what that looks like. So essentially, is your behavior being guided by values that you have adopted for yourself because you've kind of consciously put these things together and you've thought things through? Or are you just buying into something that someone else is telling you, and maybe you don't want to think about it that much, or you assume that, well, if all these other people think this thing, then surely they have to be right or something. It's when you kind of forfeit the responsibility of having to think through your actions or take responsibility for your actions, that I think is when things kind of start leaning a little bit sideways. And then it depends entirely on like what sort of systems or ideologies you're being exposed to, and how intense those pressures are.
Um, and I guess this is just a little bit of a segue into the later couple episodes, but you only touched on it for a minute. But it's I think the trickiest thing, and well, I guess what was tricky about what you did in the last couple episodes is you're sort of expounding on how you believe Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson actually agree, even if they aren't conscious of it, I guess. Um, but the one tricky area that you only like touched on for a second is how that facts give us values. So kind of like the Hume ought is problem. So I don't know if you can expound on that a little bit, how that facts can give us values.
Yeah, I really buy into the idea of emergence. So there you can have things, and that comes from complexity theory. You can have these small things come together that form these kind of higher order ideas, but you can't find those ideas if you break them down into their constituent parts. And so the third episode I did was about kind of empiricism and also tied into like consciousness a little bit. So essentially, like I see people in our minds as these emergent entities, and our values are emergent too. So you can't necessarily like, oh, you shouldn't kill people. Well, where does it say that in like, you know, the laws of mathematics or something? Well, obviously it doesn't. But if you go from math to physics to chemistry to biology to psychology to sociology, by the time you've hit sociology, then you've counted for all these other things of like, well, if I'm a person that wants to go out in the world and do things that are going to be not good for me, then it only makes sense that you want to participate in a system where other people can't inhibit with your ability to act. And then also like, I think I talked about coercion a lot in the first episode too, how the coercion itself is kind of like flying in the face of reality to some extent. If I go and kill someone and I take their resources, I don't actually have any knowledge about how the world works. And so that it isn't a long-term solution.
Yeah, and then I guess well, it's what was it? It's a tricky thing, because the other thing along those same lines that you only touched on for a minute, but it is like pretty critical, is how, well, maybe it's kind of like the underpinning theme is how Jordan Peterson gets at the idea of acting as if God exists and why that might be a better thing to do. So, and I think you were kind of saying you don't need to do that. So what's, I guess, your position on why a person should or should not act as though there's a God?
I mean, I think like that idea of acting as if there's a God is like, you have to define what God means in that context, right?
Right.
But normally I'm against that idea just because it's, I think in the episode I called it like a noble lie coming from Plato, where it's like, for me, it seems like for some reason Peterson's premise is that if you don't have this idea of God as the bedrock of your society, things are going to fall apart. But like, why is that the case if you can have like rational answers to the same questions too, which, and he is completely capable of espousing what those rational answers are.
Well,
so,
okay.
Except I think he doesn't have the correct answer to the free will issue, because he thinks that people need to have free will. I think that's why he, like, and Ben Shapiro talks about this too. Like, you need religion because otherwise you don't have free will. And I think Sam doesn't do the best argument in terms of showing how you can have free will as something where it's two-directional causality. If you think, oh, I can do anything I want, you're going to be able to act more freely than if you're telling yourself, oh, well, I'm a completely determined being.
Yeah, well, that was a really tricky thing about the determinism aspect of it. It was like determinism and then transition into like individual agency.
Sorry, my cat's like nosing at my webcam.
Oh, that's fine. No worries. But how, and there's a lot of these things, and I think you touched on it as well, as notice how Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson did it to whatever level that they were forthcoming about. But that we have to sometimes be able to hold two positions at once. And so in particular, it's that we may be able to say there is no free will, or if that there is, it's an illusion. But at the same time, and it's almost like the act as if as God exists, where there may not be free will, but it kind of seems like it. And the more that we act like it, and you got into this a little bit in at least I think the last episode, the more that we act like we have a free will, the sort of better off that we'll be.
I think it also depends on how you're defining free will, because if you're conceptualizing free will as your ability to make choices, clearly our consciousness is the thing that's acting that enables us to choose. The question is if the choice that you ultimately make is predetermined. And the answer to that, I agree with Sam, the answer is no. But then there's this thing of, well, the context that you're situated inside is going to be informing what you are, the landscape of what you are considering different viable options.
Yeah, and well, and so I guess the other thing to kind of get in on that same line is how it's still on this idea of acting as if God exists, and Peterson often talks about the whole death of God principle, and how people often misunderstand what Nietzsche was after and everything else, and how the reason that the death of God was such a lamentable, horrible thing, and maybe it'll be a good thing in the long run, potentially, but because we had, for known history, had this higher order metaphysical belief in something higher than humanity, it worked very well for known history. Now then, in the modern, and now maybe we might call postmodern era, we said, at least most of the modern world says, no, maybe not, probably not. And even if, and it's tricky because still probably I think surveying most individuals, even in, the West, they still say, oh, I believe in God. But the issue is how that they act. They're not acting in that way, and they're not behaving in that way so much as that society did before. And so I guess that the tricky thing is that before, when everybody sort of acted as if God existed, even if it was, I don't know, we might call a noble lie, or what I might just call like a more conscious leap of faith, is it made people act in a better way, and it potentially okay, because it's like this: if I assume there's no God, then I could act selfishly. Now you can say, oh, but really it's better to act in the greater good. But now the thing is, the God principle, if you're acting as if God exists in a proper way and not just a blind ideological way, the main thing is, it's kind of like that transcendent star, or that thing on the top of the dominance hierarchy, which is like the eye of Providence or the eye of Horus, which is to always pay attention, is that there are some principles that are even higher than for the greater good of humanity. Like that's how that we try to get through really difficult things, like if we should go to war or not, and these really complicated things like when is a human life alive, and when, all these really complicated things. There are some things that it's like we have to appeal to high principles that are even higher than the greater good of humanity. So how do we reconcile, one, a person finding that greater good when they just have their individual, ego conscious to work off of, but go ahead.
I don't agree with the idea of a greater good for humanity. I think that that's something that you can't really pin down or define. I agree with you that there's certain higher order values maybe that operate, that guide people's behavior. And those can either be like ideologies that cause them to do bad things, or it can be things like, oh, I want to, pursue truth and stuff like that, and pursue reason. And then those result in better outcomes. But I would argue that any sort of prescription from religion, you could just as easily, that's actually like, there's a clear reason why it's beneficial and it should be abided by. You can still rationalize that. Like the God doesn't need to come into the picture, because there's always going to be a logical explanation available too. Otherwise, it's not a real value.
And I guess I'm not trying to like have necessarily a theological debate, but the thing that I think helps make it make sense, and this is something that even what's his name, William James, talked about a lot, and those who like really got into the like core of what religious belief and religious action was about, is that you have to separate what goes on an individual level from what happens on like a institutional level. So on an institutional level, whether you want to say that's a particular church or particular ideology or whatever, that breeds all kinds of power and corruption and everything else, although there can be some good there potentially. But on the individual level of an individual just trying to deeper explore what their beliefs are, what their faith is, these deeper recesses of what that they can accomplish in the sort of an individual relationship with the transcendent or the potential of a divine. Even if a person just says, I'm a complete and total atheist, there's a relationship with faith, and even if it's a faith in nothing, there's a relationship with, on the individual level, whoever an individual is, there's a relationship with the divine or the metaphysical. So I guess it kind of gets into this whole tricky, sticky question of what it means to act as if God exists. And
I think there's two types of God where, and like, you know, in the West with like Christianity and stuff, God is, you know, big man up in the sky who's top down telling you like, this is what you should be doing or something. And it's a set of rules. Versus in the East, it's like God is in everything. And I find that interpretation a lot more compelling in terms of like metaphysics. And so I find that, like, I introduced complexity theory as the metaphysics for my podcast. And I think that ties in really beautifully with more like Buddhist Hindu ideas of just flow and causality and determinism and stuff like that is reflected in those religions. And then sometimes when Peterson's talking about God, or I think in that conversation with Sam Harris that took place in Vancouver, when Sam asks him to define it, Jordan lifts off, like he has a Google Doc or something, he's listing off all these descriptions, and it's like basically all of those things that you're describing are kind of more of the Eastern interpretation of God than it is the Western. So his definition seems to be quite different from like the average person's, who's like, oh, well, God tells me to go to church on Sunday, so I do, or whatever, versus like, well, seeing God as being just this, I don't know, natural flow and harmony that permeates through everything, and then you are just a consequence of those same forces. Then I can kind of be like, okay, I can get into that.
Yeah, and then another point that I think you made, which sort of ties this all together. I forget how you worded it, but that you said beliefs beget outcomes. So whatever you believe, kind of you manifest that. And so that could be anything. If you believe there's no God, then the world will unfold in a lack of God way. And if you believe there's a God, the world will unfold in a divine type of way. So how is it, and I guess that you were kind of getting at that to sort of work at this complexity theory issue, that everything is deterministic, but at the same time, it flows through the individual. And the way that we can kind of change our direction or change our outcome is to adapt different beliefs or adopt different beliefs. So how is it that beliefs determine our outcomes?
So like, it's sad nowadays, so many people in my generation walk around and they're atheists and they're determinists, and I think, talking about the death of God or something like that's how you see the consequences is like, if there's no viable alternative that tells you, oh, you can still lead a meaningful, fulfilling life without having this religious framework to operate under, then of course you're going to feel that way. So, like lots of people kind of think that they are stuck in their life and they're stuck in their habits, and they may dream of doing certain things, but like they don't actually think that those things are tenable. And so long as you're telling yourself, oh, I am depressed and I'm never going to do anything with my life and all the rest of it, you're going to be that way. Of course you are. There's nothing else you can think. And I think a lot of mental health issues kind of are the effect of feedback loops and rumination, where the more you tell yourself, I'm so depressed, I'm so anxious, I'm so depressed, I'm so anxious, you're going to become more and more that way. And the whole point of like cognitive behavioral therapy or something is learning to recognize those corruptions in those thought processes and then learn to redirect that attention. And so definitely the times in my life that I felt I was struggling the most with like those things, it then took the active effort of realizing the negative thought patterns of I'm like just sitting around being like, oh, I'm so depressed. And I'm like, wait, where did that come from? Do I actually feel that way? Or do I just feel kind of neutral right now? And I'm prescribing depression on top of like what's just a normal state of being. And then learning to think yourself out of those habits and into better frames of mind. Whereas like now I'm much more confident and optimistic in my approach to things.
Yeah, this kind of loops back to the whole, again, the complexity theory, and it kind of makes me think of like traffic and traffic jams, that sometimes, especially when certain roads are much more busy than others, there becomes a traffic jam or traffic accident, and then the issue is to clear that up. So same thing on the individual level, and I talked to you about this for a minute when we were setting this up, how it makes me think of complexes, like psychological complexes. Actually, I just released the podcast that I most recently released was on that subject of complexes, where complexes are like these maladapted sort of, well, we could talk about it for hours, what a complex is, but they're these maladapted sort of beliefs that we have as far as what the world is and how that we interact with it. Like you can have a complex, you can have authority complex, you can have a mother complex, you can have all these different complexes, and you can have one about like what your relationship is to a car. Especially like a lot of people will have that. If they had a car accident, they won't be able to drive or get in a car for a period of time. So I say that to say that it seems like a lot of the solution to these things is to adapt new beliefs or adopt new beliefs,
and also recognize the deterministic path that brought you to be at that point. Because until you're capable of unpacking all that, which is why Peterson does like past authoring suites and stuff, right? If you've got, and it depends, like I'm lucky, I've got like, pretty normal past. I don't have like a lot of trauma to work through or something. But if you do, it's like understanding where all of those thought patterns are coming from in your life is what helps you be able to integrate and move past them. And also being able to take those things on, not just as like, well, I incurred this trauma and I'm beyond it, but that trauma also made me who I am. And maybe I can pull that with me into the future, into something that is positive in the end.
Yeah. You brought up a good point that just made me think how usually what creates these complexes in society or in an individual is traumas. But what you just made me think is like interesting is how we don't have a lot of traumas. I mean, of course, a lot of people do, but by and large, we don't have a lot of trauma as like humanity used to have a lot of traumas, with like a lot of death, a lot of sickness, a lot of, it's just not as traumatic as it once was. And so I don't know if I think what may be happening a lot, and I'm wondering what you think about this too, is that because a lot of people don't have those personal traumas as much, they adopt, it's like they adopt traumas from previous generations or from other people. And so this kind of gets into like some other political issues, and maybe into like even what wokeness is, where you're like adopting the trauma of slavery or the trauma of white power or the trauma of like patriarchies. So, or the complexes that weren't your own, and then you adopt those from previous generations. So I don't know, what do you think that this generation might do that sometimes, as adopt previous generations or other people's traumas or complexes?
I think people have a natural need to overcome adversity. And
Yeah.
if so, if life isn't throwing a lot of adversity at you naturally, then you'll find a way to make your own. Even if that's just like,
Yeah.
struggling with addiction or something like that, where it's
Right,
like
right.
you could come from a completely well-functioning family and have no real grievances in life, and still you're struggling with something psychologically that you don't there's no real reason why it's there. I think that's a tendency that people will inflict
Right.
on themselves, and there's probably a whole host of reasons as to why that is, but that's kind of
Yeah.
my intuition about things.
I think that even that's a lot of what's going on this year, is that in general, in the modern world at least, and this isn't even exactly the whole like pinker enlightenment now thing, but it's just like in general, generally speaking, things are getting better and better. And so people should be able to say, great, things are better than ever. And of course, there's still problems in the world that we need to deal with. Uh, so since things are getting better and better, we should be able to unite on things that we can work on to overcome together. Like even this year with the virus, it's like, okay, here's this horrible virus. How are we going to work together to combat it and the implications on the economy and everything else? And then same thing, like, with the election that we're having here, it's like, okay, sure, this is an important election. How can we unite? But like this year more than ever, we're doing the opposite. So I wonder what you think of that, as far as people who we could be uniting, but instead we just have this natural need to kind of like start screwing things up and being more and more divisive.
Yeah, I think like at least in people my age, I really fault education in the universities a lot. I
Yeah.
think that the institutions are rapidly falling apart and becoming
Right.
obsolete, and they're kind of doing what they can to cling on to some form of relevancy.
Right.
But they're just kind of churning out ideologues, and so all the people like my peers that have beliefs that are so dramatically different from my own, I can't really blame them for it, because like they're just getting indoctrinated in school,
Right.
and like the schools don't even try to hide it. Like my political science class that I took, like my intro course, I remember reading the textbook, and it just had like definitions for like liberalism and conservatism. And this definition was essentially, for conservatism was like, this is a bunch of hateful people that just want to keep you stuck in the past. Like it was like so clearly biased. Like the entire textbook didn't give a single kind of compelling reason why would anyone be a conservative. They don't even want to address the issue. They just kind of like, okay, we're gonna flit right over that. And like all of the profs, like, because I live in Winnipeg, it's an extremely liberal city. So like the entire university is just it's ran by Marxists and feminists and all the rest
and
of
they're
it.
not even hiding it at all. They're open about it.
Yeah.
We're openly Marxist.
Yeah, like right wing is a bad word nowadays. Like how are we supposed to have unity when it's like one side seems, I think much more often than not, conservatives are just right wing people, because I don't identify as a conservative, but like you're going to be a lot more empathetic towards people who think differently than you, because at some point you kind of had to learn the same lessons or something. Whereas nowadays the ideology is very much on the side of like, these people aren't your friends, and they're a means to your political ends. So the calls for unity now in the United States, it's like, okay, well, now that we're in power, now we can unify. And then I think social media makes things, I don't like to follow social media for anything. I like grew up on the internet. I love social media.
Right.
But also like I'm probably not your average user.
Yeah.
But I think that probably can make things both better and worse simultaneously, right? Because it's facilitating conversations towards people that want to have productive conversations, and it's also facilitating radicalization for people that are vulnerable to it. So
yeah, that's your cat.
yeah.
This is okay. So sometimes I try to figure this out, and like if any one sort of like group or organization or anything can be faulted, and I try to even like let the universities off the hook, but I don't think they can be let off the hook, because the reason is, and again, Peterson brings this up a lot, how that their job is always has been, at least as long as there's been these type of universities in the modern world, has been to help people not take either position, right, left, theology or atheist or anything else, but to help people learn how to think and to develop their independent critical thinking. And even when I was in college a long time ago, over 10 years ago, it at least came across that way. And there was none of this like now I've like try to help some friends with homework, and it's all this like, woke stuff just for like typical homework. And it's like, I don't, the thing is, I don't think there's necessarily some big conspiracy. I think what it is that the it's a cultural thing. Like those in the university start saying, let's do this to promote anti-racism or something like that. And then other teachers or faculty or whatever might be like, no, that's a bad idea. Let's do what we're supposed to do. But then they're like, oh, but does that mean I'm racist? Okay, let's just do it the anti-racist way. So I don't know. What do you think as far as how we've gotten to this? And this is kind of getting into, by the way, the point of, I think your next podcast that you're working on now is the political aspect. So how do you think we got here, and how can we start to solve these issues?
I think like a big component is like get the government out of universities. Oh my God, that would fix so much so quickly. The push for like, universal university education is so, I can't, it's so stupid. I don't even know where to start with it. Yeah. And like my mom, it's funny because both of my parents are PhDs. My mom's a university professor. My dad does postdoc work for his university. And I've been like pretty close with most of my university profs too. And like all the stories I hear is just how the problem is like,
are they tenured, by the way?
I'm not sure if I think my mom's got tenure now. Yeah. And then my dad isn't really, he's not a professor.
Okay.
But like my sense is that all of the issues lie in the administration and the bureaucracy, and that's where the wokeness gets its roots, and then everything trickles down from there. And then just in the hiring process and stuff like that, like there's going to be so much self-selection bias that's occurring. And the universities they've got zero incentive to churn out students into a field that they can actually work in, right? So, and the problem too is like the push is now, if you're in high school, of course you're going to go to university. The boys are slightly luckier because they're going to naturally gravitate towards STEM more. But then all of the girls, by and large, are going to be going into the humanities. And it's like the university doesn't care if they have 500 psych students. Yeah, the humanities are garbage. A big part of that I blame on social science, because we've moved away from theory and towards trying to like make everything empirically provable. Where like whereas the goal, if you want to get a degree in psychology, it doesn't really matter like if you have a lot of papers backing up your your process or whatever. What matters is, can you go and treat people? Like the outcome, the education should be directed towards producing the goal you want to achieve, not like making it more valid through and empiricizing everything or scientifying everything.
And I guess this gets into, again, this is part of like what your next podcast is going to be on that you're working on now is, okay, so I would say if I have to identify, I also identify as libertarian. However, that's a little bit of a paradox because libertarians are anti-political party. So it's almost like they it's a little bit of a paradox to have them in a political party, but I guess you could call it a political philosophy. It would be most accurate. But also with that, the tricky thing about the perception of the philosophy or even the party is that it's perceived often almost as anarchist, that, oh, we just shouldn't have government and government should be limited. But, and this is where I'm wondering what you think and kind of what you're getting into with universities is, I think all of the proper like regulations and things that government is doing that they're screwing up can and should be done somehow through the private sector.
Yeah.
And that would include schools and pretty much everything else. And there maybe there needs to be new ways to do that business structure or things like that, especially as, there's certain corporations that are in a lot of ways more powerful than any government ever has been. So what do you think as far as how that libertarianism should be actually implemented?
I think like just defining things in terms of physical harm is the easiest way to solve most problems. Like most of the reasons people don't like libertarianism is it's like, okay, well, what if XYZ happens and someone gets hurt? And the answer is, well, you're able to impose regulations that prevent me from like being like, oh, buy this container of apple juice and really it's filled with poison. Like, there's really common sense solutions to most things.
Well, and I would just say that the issue with something like that, it's a good example of how, there's things like the FDA that helps with that, but also with a lot of these food inspection organizations, I forget all the names for all of them, but there's private organizations that will do, a lot of these regulatory things on, food and drugs and those type of things. Not just the FDA, but organizations that are more privatized. And so I think that's an example of how it works pretty well because it's been properly privatized, but also has a level of government partnership with it. So I don't know what you think as far as government and privatized partnerships like that. That's maybe more the way to go to solve some of these regulatory issues.
I think, generally speaking, I'm just pro privatizing everything, but then that includes pretty substantial caveats in terms of like, I think the government should be able to regulate for truth in terms of I can't sell you something if I'm lying about what it is I'm selling. Or you can have an independent certification board that goes around and says, okay, these restaurants abide by these, cleanliness standards. That doesn't have to be a government agency. It can be some random self-starter agency. But still, if they've got their sticker of approval on the door, that sticker has to actually mean what it says it means. You can't just be printing them off and posting them when you've got rats in the kitchen.
Because if they are government run, then they instantly breed corruption.
Yes.
There's so much of that, especially like here where I'm at near Los Angeles. Everything's just goes through bribery, whether there's going to be a building to go up or whatever. Everything ends up
stifles entrepreneurship too in terms of like I remember being in Mexico and you can get the most delicious tacos that are made on the street in some little back alley by some lovely Mexican woman, and there's no like her ability to make an income would be stopped the moment someone comes and says, well, you can't sell back alley tacos. But the thing is as a tourist, I can pretty easily make a judgment call. Am I willing to risk a small chance of food poisoning for this woman that seems like she's got her shit together, given that she's cooking on
there's probably a line of people and it smells delicious. So
exactly,
those are things that help make the decision.
The rule is if she says, oh yeah, this is a fish taco, then sells me a taco with a rat in it, then I've got a reason to get upset over it. But
and if there's a lot of locals lined up, then those locals are probably lined up because they're not getting sick off of the tacos.
Exactly.
So there's other means than just the government. And which, by the way, this kind of gets back into the communistic way of looking at the world, or maybe the left or woke way of looking at the world to a degree. Is my whole thing with all that is a lot of those might be rooted in good ideas or good principles even, but if you have to force it on people, then probably not. So if you can put these ideas, whatever that they are, through just the free culture or somehow through the private sector, then great, because if it's working, people adopt it and it'll work great. But if you have to take over the government to force it on everybody, that's probably a horrible idea. So I guess with that too, since like I mentioned, this is getting into your next podcast. Is there anything that you can tell us as far as your preview for the next podcast coming out and what that's going to be about, getting into politics and things?
It's just tackling what the implications of like the moral structure that I've established, that kind of hyper rational self-interest, individualism, and like heroism, how that the consequences of that on a society. What are the rules and principles that we should be kind of establishing our societies around? And for me, the answer is libertarianism. And then this episode is going to be me just very broadly sketching out the arguments for it and then addressing the common counter arguments. because there's so many, and trying to do things in a persuasive enough way that like my friends that are Marxists can still listen and be like, oh, okay, like I can see where she's coming from or whatever. And then I think what I'm going to do is the next, like this is the first 5 is establishing more philosophy and psychology. And then the next 5 are going to be the implications of government. Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think is the difference between communism and Marxism?
Oh, I don't know.
No, the reason I ask it, you just made me think of that when you mentioned your Marxist friends, is how, like in America at least, if you're taking the citizenship test, you're like, you fail if you say I'm a communist. But on the other hand, people all the time are, now it's like people don't really say they're communist, but there are millions of people that are like proud of their Marxism. So I don't know if it's like this weird sort of like, I want to say I'm a communist, but I'm not allowed to, so I'll just give it a different word.
Yeah, I have no clue if I'm sure the communists and Marxists have established meaningful distinctions, or maybe it's just because you can say, well, communism has failed so many times, and they go, I'm not a communist, I'm a Marxist. That's never been tried before. Maybe it's something about adherence to like, well, if you were actually doing things by the book, it'd end up completely different. But I don't know.
Tricky, complicated stuff. All right. So is there anything you can tell us as far as how the audience might be able to follow you, interact with you, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, I'd love that. I've got like I don't know if you post links or anything. I've got like a link tree, but like I'm just Jane Gatsby basically everywhere. Cool. Jane Gatsby with an underscore in between the words on Twitter. That's where I'm doing most of my shenanigans at the moment. But I'm on YouTube, I'm on Spotify, I'm on like all the podcasting platforms, and then Twitter and Instagram.
Cool. All right. Well, again, I like what you're doing and hope you keep it up. Do you have any anything that you can say, or like your long-term plans with what you're doing, or is it just going to be this type of podcast for the foreseeable future?
I think I've realized I've got like another 5 to 15 episodes I could do, but I'd probably do like finish up like the first season and then do another season that's 10 episodes too. And then after that, I think I'll be done, especially just because of the style I've chosen. It's so much work to put in that I like the process, but if I'm not kind of working on establishing my ideas, once I've got the groundwork down, I'd rather just be engaging in conversations. So I've been toying with different things. I like the idea of kind of setting up a live stream or something and just I need a big enough audience that I could have viewers drop in and talk to me about like, oh, okay, I'm interested in exploring this thing. Can you share your opinions? And developing ideas like on the fly with a group of people that are all interested in those same ideas. Then I'm hoping that once the world gets back to normal, there'll be lots of fun events to go to and conversations to have. Like my big goal is like, I want to be sitting on a stage in front of an audience across from someone and having conversations in person, just because I think that's the best way to do things.
Yeah, you're right. The only thing that I would, I don't know, recommend or advise is at some point, I think you should do things like this, just have this type of conversation podcast. And I think there's definitely an audience for it. I don't know at what pace, but maybe just once in a while, get some cool people and have these kind of conversations.
I love doing stuff like this if somebody else invites me.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure how I feel about hosting my own podcast, just because it's like there's so many of them. But absolutely, I'd love to. Anyone who wants to hit me up and have a chat, if there's some sort of following associated, I'd love to do it. I'm so happy to talk with you.
All right, I'll put all the links there so people can go on Twitter and invite you on their podcast, and maybe we'll do it again sometime in the next year, I guess. But cool. All right, keep up the good work, and we'll look forward to it.
Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good one. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, you too.
All right, bye.